Hello, everyone. My name is Daryl Martin. I'm one of the general editors of the Sociological Review. It's a pleasure to welcome you all to today's webinar, which is about writing for international audiences, the author's perspective. This is the second of three webinars this summer held by the Sociological Review. It complements very much last week's webinar, which was the first one on transnational engagements with sociological imagination. And later this month, on the 30th of August, we will be having the third and final webinar in our series, which is about peer reviewing papers from the global south. So thank you all for coming to today's webinar. It's great to see so many people on the call. I'd like to particularly welcome Dr. Siyang Cao, who is an assistant research fellow at the Institute of National Culture Research at Dali University in China. Siyang has published widely in the field of Chinese masculinities, in the field of family and relationships, and more recently, temporal perspectives on aging in China. Her research is interested in the roles played by cultural values and local knowledge in shaping personal identities and everyday experience. She's published widely in journals such as the Journal of Gender Studies, Sociological Research Online, and of course the Sociological Review, which is why we've invited her to come and talk about her research and her experience as an author more generally. So, Siyang, thank you very much for joining us in today's webinar, which is about writing for an international audience. We're going to be talking primarily about your paper, Cultivating Shenti in Everyday Life, Self-Identity and Embodied Masculinity in China, which was published in the Sociological Review last year in our May 2022 issue. Yeah. So we're going to talk a little bit about your experience of writing it for the journal, especially with how you introduced aspects of Chinese culture for an international readership. We'll also talk about your experience of the review process for the paper as an author, but we might also speak to you about your experience of being a reviewer yourself. And we will have time for questions from those watching the webinar live. So to all our kind of audience members, if you have questions, can I ask you to post them into the chat just as they occur. So as we go along, I'll pick them up at the end and I'll raise any of your individual questions, but feel free to write them into the chat as we go along. And I'll pick them up probably about kind of 45 minutes after Siyang and I have had a kind of a discussion in general terms about the paper, but also her experience of writing for an international audience as a writer. Now, before we start that discussion and that conversation, I just want to point out a few things about the webinar series. So it's a series of three events that's held by the Sociological Review Foundation. I just wanted to explain for our kind of audience. That's a registered charity which is funded from profits from the Sociological Review Journal. And the foundation has a purpose to really advocate for sociological research in wider public and political debates. The foundation has strategies to help it to do that. So it's got targeted strategies in terms of promoting sociological research amongst wider public audiences, and we do that through our magazine and podcast series. It's got a very strong program of work and a history of supporting early career researchers through particular events that are targeted and schemes like Writing Retreat for early career researchers. We have the Sociological Review Fellowship, which is an annual competition awarded to one scholar each year to develop the work that came from their PhD research and to give you a little bit of a breathing space to develop that research and write up your findings. And we have events like our annual public lecture and indeed these webinars. Now, there's a link to the Sociological Review Foundation website in the chat, so I'd encourage you to take that link out and learn more about the work of the foundation. You'll find that you'll be able to subscribe to our newsletter there, so there will be a link in the chat, but you'll find it at the bottom right hand corner of the foundation website pages. I'd also encourage you to follow us on social media. Again, the link is just next to that link for the newsletter. And just to let you know that the video will be available for you to review later on soon. And again, you'll find information about all of our events through the Sociological Foundation website. Can I just say that there will be a link in the chat to offer some feedback for you to kind of offer any feedback you have about today's session, what you find helpful, what you'd like us to kind of think about in terms of planning future events. Please do take the time. It'll only take a few minutes to add your thoughts via there. So that's all I've got to say in terms of housekeeping and the general context for today's webinar. So it'd be nice to just begin the discussion with you now, Siyang. So first, Siyang, it might be helpful for you to explain the study that your paper that we published last year was based on, to take a little bit of time to tell the audience about the type of issues that the paper explores, tell us something about your study participants, the methods you used, and the overall arguments you had in the paper. So over to you.
Okay, thank you, Daryl, for the introduction. And I'm very happy to be invited here today to talk about the paper and also share my writing process. Well, the paper Cultivating Shenti in Everyday Life, it examines the everyday processes by which Chinese young men make sense of and articulate ideal embodied masculinity as they are situated in different relationships. More specifically, I look at what kind of masculinities are formed through a variety of embodied experiences, particularly those informed by Confucian values, which is a focus of the article. And throughout the paper, the Chinese notion of shenti, meaning body self in the context of my work, is adopted as a critical theoretical lens to tease out the different layers of body self and also relationality that underpin the man's bodily practices and social interactions. And in terms of methodology, it draws on data collected from a larger project that looks at masculinity formation among young men aged between 22 and 32 at the time of the interview. So that's 2015. I conducted 30 semi-structured in-depth interviews in 2 Chinese cities, and a bit of the demographic information about my participants. They are all self-identified as heterosexual, and the majority of them were employed in white-collar or junior governmental jobs. And they also support normative ideas of marriage and parenthood, holding a bachelor's degree or above. So I suggest that the men in this research can be generally seen as being located in the middle social groupings. So it means that they are indicative of the wider male population who are often seen as unproblematic, normal, common, and living up to the normative notion of Chinese manhood. However, because their identity are seen as not being in crisis, they have received relatively limited attention in the existing English literature. This is an important reason why I chose to focus on this relatively, with quote, ordinary group of Chinese men. The analysis section of the paper contains 3 parts. So maintaining a normal shenti, displaying a racialized shenti, and remaking a moral shenti. I argue in the paper that the Chinese masculine self is essentially constitutive of and constructed through shenti during the man's everyday experiences, which reveals the continuing significance of Confucian cultural values in the contemporary world. Another key aspect of my argument is that the male shenti, and actually more broadly speaking, Chinese masculinities, are both relational construct. In the paper, I've shown that the male body is constantly intertwined with the surrounding world, ranging from their parents, their female partners, to colleagues, and sometimes even strangers. And in most occasions, shenti is not a personal consideration, but subject to the surveillance of a variety of relationships and constitutive of those relationships. Theoretically, the article engages with traditional cultural values of the ideal body self, as I've just introduced, and also a feminist interactionist approach to gendered embodiment. By doing so, I intend to, I hope, the paper can enrich existing debates around the sociology of the body and embodiment by foregrounding local concepts and intellectual thoughts, well, which I think we can discuss it in more details later.
Yeah, thank you very much. I was very struck, actually. You just mentioned, you know, the relational construction of all this identity work, and I thought that was very powerful in the paper. The way that you said, although these are kind of individual men speaking about themselves and their bodies, we must always remember that they are situated in a series of networks, and networks with kind of family, with friends, with kind of parents, with family members, but also with wider kind of social ideals as well. I thought that was very kind of powerful in the paper. I mean, one of the most interesting things about your paper, and I suppose especially for a global audience, is your introduction of Chinese concepts, often derived from Confucian culture. So in particular, shenti, that's the clear focus of the paper. But you also introduce a lot of other terms that I think have significance within Chinese context, and you spell them out and you translate them, so such as li, for example.
Yeah.
I was struck by something that you wrote in the methodology section, where you said that you purposefully delayed translating your data into English so that you could work with some of these terms in their original context. And that was a very deliberate decision that you made, not to kind of translate everything up front, but to continue working with certain themes. Could you talk us through some of these terms, and also the process of working with them in your analysis and your writing of the article?
Yes. Yeah, let me start with this shenti concept. This is a phrase in the Chinese language, which contains shen and ti. These are two words, and they are both root words for body in Chinese. So shen has the meaning of animate body, person, self, lifetime, with different sort of meanings, and ti can be understood as inanimate body, physic, flesh. So because the term shenti combines the two kinds of body, I use shenti that imply a person or self, which means that I'm talking about both body person and physic body. From a culture and philosophical perspective, shenti unites the body and the mind through its reflexive sociality and relationality, which distinguishes itself from the mind-body dichotomy that have prevailed in past years. I mean, although that's a long time ago, but in some global contexts. But in Confucian tradition, shenti is perceived as an aesthetic expression of the self and a variable statement of meaning and value, to quote Tu Weiming and Ams. So rather than a material object of regulation, shenti is an indispensable dimension of gendered selfhood. It is straightforwardly identified with the self, which is a prominent feature of the Confucian worldview in relation to this paper. Also, the cultivation of shenti has long been intimately connected to the social construction of ideal Chinese manhood throughout different historical periods. For example, from the representation of male elites in conventional cultural texts to critiques of the fragile and weak male body in the 1980s, and more recently public discussions around the crisis of masculinity, those flower-like young man, soft masculinity, those kind of discussions. But the meaning of shenti has been shaped also by other schools of thought in Chinese history, especially Taoism. I think I'll talk about how I come to this point in more detail later. But to introduce Taoist ideas about body, they are also central to the philosophy of body self in traditional Chinese thoughts, especially in Chinese traditional Chinese medicine, say like different ways of life nurturance and the pursuit of immortality. So I mentioned this point has also been reflected in the paper. Since ideal forms of masculine embodiment in China have been strongly influenced by Confucian thinking, so here I mainly discuss shenti in relation to local and Confucian perspectives. Well, what else? Shenti provides an important source of knowledge to help us understand the process of identity formation and social life in China, in the urban Chinese context. For example, when I asked the participants about their understanding of the ideal male body, many of them emphasized what a man's body carries, in addition to how the body looks. I was also quite struck when I read my transcripts, because it's quite different from the critical masculinity studies that I read, whose data are collected in, say, European and American context. Like one of my participants says, a man should look tidy, but it mainly depends on your style of doing things. It's all about your behavior in everyday life and how other people think of you. I don't think a cool face or big muscles are that important. So it's quite typical among the men I interviewed. It's clear that his description of the ideal male body is entangled with meanings of the masculine self, which is beyond the term body is used in many existing literature. Their narratives about shenti often figured culturally expected male characteristics. So I think the Chinese term shenti is more useful to demonstrate what male embodiment really means to my participants in their everyday life. It's also useful to highlight an epistemological difference in terms of how body is perceived in our Monday lives. Yes, that's something I want to talk about shenti. And yeah, the notion of li that Daryl just mentioned is another word in Chinese vocabulary I used in the paper. Li is translated variously as ritual, propriety, or etiquette. According to the teaching of Confucius, the proper practices of li is an exclusively male trait and essential to the cultivation of Junzi, meaning a Confucian gentleman. Li is an embodied virtue that can only be learned and performed through physical actions. The embodiment of li involves behaving in proper manners and morals depending on the situation, with such a display being recognized by others. Although formal etiquette of li, such as complicated procedures during sacrifices or funeral rites, have been dramatically simplified or even abandoned today, those some daily routines remain meaningful for the man. I talked with. So I can see from their narratives that masculine self is responsible for reflexively working on and presenting his shenti in everyday encounters. But unlike shenti, this word was used frequently by participants themselves following my questions during the interviews. Li is more of an interpretive tool that I developed to articulate features of masculine embodiment and organize my analysis. Yeah, I'm aware of the risk of overinterpretation or explanation, but it's also true that some of the men's narratives are strongly evocative of traditional meanings of this term. For example, they talk about fitting into the workplace through an embodied presentation of the self and looking good for others through proper dressing or body training. So although situated in a different context, these understandings of the male body are very much in line with emphasis on relational bodily cultivation in the Confucian traditions. Yeah, but I need to admit that at the initial stage of writing, I did not pay enough attention to address the specific cultural context of Chinese masculinity. I remember I used terms such as the absent male body, the disembodied male body, the healthy male body, such and such, to frame my arguments. This paper was developed from my doctoral project, and I'm very grateful to my supervisors who reminded me to let my participants talk. So I just abandoned the first draft and reread the transcripts again until important themes emerged, including those discussed in this paper. This is also the reason why I worked with the Chinese transcripts when I drafted the paper, since language itself carries rich historical and cultural meanings. For example, if I translated shenti into body or body self in the first place, the transcripts might lose sort of cultural flavor to some extent. Of course, this is also related to my nationality as a native Chinese, and all the interviews were conducted in Chinese. For me, working with my first language is helpful because it reminded me of the interview setting, include how our conversation moved on, their facial expressions, postures, their tones when talking about certain topics. It's also useful to capture the implicit help me to realize those implicit or metaphorical meanings in the participants' words, the subtext. And after this, writing English with the selected English transcriptions allowed me to read their words from a fresh perspective. So it kind of changed my positionality between an insider and outsider, although it's not it's not as easy as it sounds, like insider and outsider. They are also often intersected with each other. And also this writing process was facilitated by doing a theoretical bridging. As the analysis part shows, the Chinese framework of shenti, informed by traditional cultural repertoires, can forge critical links with feminist and sociological theories of the body. For instance, I suggest that shenti illustrates the theory of embodied selfhood in feminist interactionism, which encompasses how we make sense of what we feel, what we can make intelligible to ourselves as feeling and what we can convey to others. Therefore, shenti enables us to explore the intersection between gender, class, age, and other axes of identity that are always socially embedded. So I'm hoping that this concept can provide a basis from which to gain greater specificity about the lived experience of young men in today's urban China, and may even offer insights about the lived experience of male bodies more broadly.
Yeah, I think that
too much.
No, that's so interesting. So many of the things that you spoke about are so interesting. So the idea that you will kind of remain with certain terms that are very important in terms of your analysis, that you keep them in their original kind of linguistic context and cultural context. I think that's really interesting. You said that in order to, if you translated shenti too soon, you would lose the complexity and the kind of the intersecting cultural, social, medical, physical, material, and spiritual kind of like elements, which shenti combines, I guess. That's what you're saying. So you would lose that kind of the intersection of all those different kind of bodily norms.
Yeah, I suppose this is not the only method to approach transcripts to highlight the ontological importance of my participants' own words. I think when I reflect on this issue, I really think it's closely related to my nationality. I suppose if people whose first language is English, French, Germany, or other language doing research, say in China, they may adopt a different approach in terms of transcription and the initial analyze process. But for me, this decision to delay transcription into English is quite useful. Yeah.
I think it's important, and also something else that you kind of like mentioned. So there's a Taoist kind of tradition of understanding shenti as well as a Confucian. I think that's really important as well. It's an important point to make in terms of the complexity of Chinese culture. It's the complexity of all cultures, really, the way that nested within kind of a simple word like Chinese or British or American or Chilean, there's a whole host of varying and competing and kind of contrasting traditions. So we do need to be very careful in terms of doing justice to that complexity, which is why I kind of asked the question about your analytical decision to stick with the original concept in the original language, and use that as an opportunity to translate your arguments and connect them sometimes with concepts from Western traditions, but also sometimes distinguishing. So one of the things that you were saying there is, I wanted really to distinguish the sense of embodiment that I get through shenti through some of the Western understandings of embodiment. There are points of connection, but there are also points of distinction.
Yeah. Yes, I think the paper can be further improved by articulate the complexities of Confucian cultural values. I still use, although the paper has gone through several rounds of revision, but I think I still use the word Confucian values, Confucian cultural heritage in a quite broad sense. Yes, and this kind of thinking has gone through like several rounds of revisions in different historical periods, and also it's subject to different political forces in the Chinese history. Also, it's quite, and this theoretical bridging that I mentioned, this can be quite surprising, but also exciting sometimes. It's very interesting to see that this ancient wisdom from a Chinese who lived like hundreds or thousands of years ago can have this intimate conversation with the Western body theorists or sociological or sociologists. So yeah, I quite enjoyed this process.
Well, I enjoyed it as a reader. I thought it was really interesting rereading your article for today's webinar, thinking about the way in which the terms sometimes intersected with Western theories such as embodied selfhood, and kind of how you made that, kind of brought that into dialogue with Shenti. But I was also struck by sometimes your deliberate avoidance of particular ideas coming from, I guess, Western or Eurocentric knowledge. So, for example, when you deliberately say, I'm not going to call my participants middle class, they are from a kind of like a middle kind of like social grouping, but middle class kind of reduces the complexity that comes from, you know, kind of like living with a middle income in a rural or an urban setting, or, you know, kind of like regional differences as well. So I wonder if you could say something about this kind of this decision making as you wrote, because all of this is about your work's attempt to use the phrase that you use, to provincialize the basis of Eurocentric knowledge, and I guess add depth and complexity to some of these terms that we use all the time, like embodiment or like class.
Yeah, this is provincializing the basis of Eurocentric knowledge. I feel it's so ambitious, and I hope I've achieved this goal to some extent in this paper. Yeah, the decision talking about the middle class term, because I remembered my participants, they didn't unanimously identify themselves with the term middle class. For me, to my point of view, some of them can be categorized as a member of middle class, but they themselves rejected this label during the interview. So that's the main reason why I decide not to use this word. And also, this is a conflicting, the middle class question is a conflicting one among both native Chinese scholars and also Chinese specialists from other contexts. So yeah, I remember I write a lot about why I deliberately avoid using middle class in the dissertation. While this task of provincializing the basis of Eurocentric knowledge, my reflection on this topic has been influenced by the way I was trained and also my experience as an overseas student in the UK for 5 or 6 years or more. Because my undergraduate degree I did in China, and it was broadcasting and journalism. So a large part of the course focused on pragmatic skills. And after that, I finished my postgraduate degrees in the UK, which means that my academic knowledge was mostly obtained in British institutions. And after that, the experience of conducting fieldwork back in China while reading and writing English made me reflect on this halfness of my identity as a researcher. While it also impacted the way I think about how I should present my findings, whom I'm writing for, and more broadly about knowledge production and distribution. I think this, in terms of this work, my attempt to challenge Eurocentric knowledge was done through 2 routes. One is to maintain a sense of cultural self-awareness, that is to highlight historical and cultural specificities embedded in the local context. to make the familiar strange. Well, the other one is to think about how to present my work to other Chinese specialists, which can be rather tricky sometimes because these two lines of thinking, these two lines of logics intersect with each other, and sometimes it's likely to overstate cultural particularity.
Yeah, very, very interesting. I mean, I think you're kind of raising a lot of issues that will be central to everyone, you know, whenever they're writing from within their own kind of cultural context, and when they're thinking about who their audience is, and asking those kind of very fundamental questions can really help during the writing process. I want to kind of move us on to just asking you a few questions about your experience of writing this paper for the sociological review and the review process. So I wonder if you might just start us by saying something kind of like briefly about why you chose the journal, how you saw your paper fitting within the aims and scope of the journal. I mean, if you can just give us a sense of why you chose the sociological review for this paper.
At first, it was very straightforward because I read the sociological review a lot, and I really like this journal. It publishes high quality research and often offer theoretically inspired approaches to emerging social issues. It's quite innovative. And for me, this shenti paper is quite satisfactory in terms of its theoretical depth and analytical approach. So I sort of submit my best work to the sociological review. So I'm also eager to communicate my reflections on the knowledge flow between the East and West to more readers, as we just talked about. Also, in terms of the topic of this journal, broadly body and embodiment, and also masculinities and gender studies, the journal has published many quite much cited papers in this broad interdisciplinary field. So I believe it fit in previous debates around body and embodiment and also gender. Also, what else? And my work engages with this feminist interactionist approach, as well as highlighting the continuing importance of traditional cultural values. So it derives from a qualitative project. So I think it demonstrates the relationship between the theoretical and empirical through this research, which is, I think, highlighted in the aims and scopes of this journal, which we can find on the website.
Could I just say that that's really important? Some of those things that you said, it is quite clear that this was a really good fit for the journal and that you knew the journal. And sometimes that's one of the pieces of advice I would give to authors looking to submit to the journal. Kind of give us a sense that you understand what debates the journal has published. So we want to publish a diversity of voices. We want to publish papers from every part of the world, but they must speak to the kinds of fundamental sociological debates that we have a history of publishing in the journal. And we give actually in the submission process a little box, which sometimes I think prospective authors haven't really anticipated, that there's a box to say, why does your research fit with this journal? And I just encourage people, I'd encourage people to really kind of take that seriously and write out in a little bit of kind of like detail, just kind of how you see your research fitting with the aims and scope of the journal, and do read the aims and scope of the journal. As you said, Siyang, it's definitely in there. It's open on the website, and so engage with that when positioning your own paper.
Yeah, I think I always submit my manuscripts to the journal that I read a lot.
Yeah.
I think it also saves your time, right? Because if you submit to the journal that you've never read, perhaps, or you even didn't read their aim and scopes or just some general descriptions of the paper, it's very likely your paper doesn't fit in the journal's main ethos. Also, the thing is, when I submitted the manuscript, the journal was, I think, it was working towards greater internationalization by supporting early career researchers and inviting papers from, say, the global south or those regions where sociology is relatively underdeveloped. I found this from the journal's manifesto, when I searched for the manifesto yesterday, and I realized it has been changed. So yeah, I think the Sociological Review has indeed become a more international journal as it aimed to achieve.
Thank you. Yeah, the manifesto may change, but we definitely do encourage a diversity of studies, of voices in the journals, and we're keen to support early career researchers. So, Siyang, can I ask you to cast your mind back to the review process, and can I get you to think about how it helped in terms of maybe broadening the interest of the paper? Did you feel it helped in terms of helping you to present your findings in a focused way, your arguments, and your analysis for an international readership?
Yeah, I've familiarized myself with the whole reviewing process, and I think there are the comments were especially helpful in terms of helping to widen the article's theoretical scope and present my analysis for an international readership. I think there are, for me, there are three impressive points of view. The first thing is the theoretical ground of this article. One of the reviewers suggested me to explore how phenomenology might fit in with my arguments and analysis. Also, yeah, especially in relation to the concept of body self and the oneness of body and mind. While these are important cultural heritage from Chinese and also East Asia, feminist theories influenced by, say, Merleau-Ponty also, they have mentioned similar perspectives. Also, I've been suggested to explore the critical link between feminist interactionism and Confucianism. So yeah, these views enabled me to reflect on the binary between the so-called East and West theories, sociological theories. Also, I remember one of the reviewers recommended that I can ground the paper more firmly in the cultural historical account of masculinities in Maoist and post-Mao times. So in the first draft of the paper, it opened with a discussion of Western theories and accounts of masculinities as a way to make the point to make my point that the notion of shenti is different. It's different, so it looks quite different. The introduction of the paper looked quite different from how it reads now. So this reviewer encouraged me to turn the table around and tell the readers about how masculinity in China has been studied, starting by a discussion of the relevant China-based literatures on masculinities. So I think these comments made me more confident to justify the sociological value of my work. So I can start with the local and gradually move on to talk about how this topic is relevant to discussions in other global contexts and in relation to existing studies. Also, the reviewing process helped me to be more critical when talk about shenti as a Confucian heritage. I think I've mentioned this, right? Because maintaining a balance between these local specificities and global knowledge can be a quite difficult task sometimes. I think, well, in the early drafts of this paper, I sort of overlooked how understandings of shenti has also been formed by and varied according to Confucianism, Taoism, Buddhism in the Chinese context. So I was also suggested to provide some background information about these different schools of thought in relation to shenti in the paper to enable my readers to have a better understanding of what I'm talking about. Yeah, these points, because these points were sometimes easy to be taken for granted because my position and my familiarity with these Chinese experiences. Yeah.
Yeah, so I suppose that's you're speaking about qualities that we hope will kind of result from a very kind of constructive, a critical but constructive peer review process. It's that kind of that prompt for you to just articulate the specificity of your kind of study in a little bit more depth because you're so familiar with it. The peer reviewers are looking at it with fresh eyes, and yeah. I know that you've reviewed papers for this journal, so you've seen the reviewing process from the other side, not just from the author's side. I mean, can you draw on your experiences as a reviewer, not just for this journal, but for other journals too, and tell the audience what you would look for yourself in terms of good quality sociological research that speaks across different cultural contexts?
Yeah. Personally, I'd also like to see authors who explore the links either theoretically or empirically between their research and similar themes located in other contexts. I think this can make the argument more convincing and also demonstrate the author's understanding of their field of research. It's also a critical issue to challenge this disciplinary boundary. And yes, because, well, I think the literature review part can often cause troubles in the reviewing process. Yeah, when I say troubles, I mean, as a reviewer, I often feel that the literature review part can be improved to some extent. And also the other one, although it sounds very basic, but research questions should really be clearly outlined upfront. And I think it's important to capture the reviewer's attention by demonstrating a sharp focus in the interaction rather than asking the reviewer to look for your findings being scattered around. Yeah, we may sometimes forget to think about, to know that the reviewers are not as familiar with the research as we are as the author.
Yeah, that's great advice. Having gone through the review process as a writer, do you have any particular pieces of advice for people in the audience in terms of how they would approach submitting to this journal? Any standout pieces of advice or wisdom?
Nothing particular, I think, but yeah, as we mentioned, read the journal's aims and scope, and also in terms of the sociological review, it has a nice website. We including its manifesto and recent online magazines and such. And also, I think doing a keywords search within the journal is quite useful to expand your knowledge about a field of research. For, say, in my occasion, I look for masculinity, China, and body and embodiment, such and such. I think it demonstrates your knowledge about this journal.
think that's absolutely right. That's actually a very good piece of advice. It's a very practical piece of advice, but it really helps the journal editor who receives your paper, and then if it proceeds to peer review, it really helps to situate your research, your paper. If you've done that kind of preparatory work of really investigating and researching the journal, what the kind of debates have been in its recent past, and connecting your research to those, and those kind of very, very practical tips actually will help you to do that. So we have got a few minutes for anybody who's got any questions. So I'm just going to go to the chat, see if anybody's posting any questions here, or we have a minute or two for you to post questions right now, and I'll take the questions and we'll discuss them. So questions for Siyang, questions for myself, or even just any comments on your own experience as in terms of submitting work to either this journal or other journals. Okay, so whilst we're waiting, I'm going to give just a minute for people to do that. But whilst we're waiting, I just want to remind people that this is the second webinar in a series of 3 this summer. And this summer, the journal has taken a decision to really investigate the question of kind of transnational, international scholarship and writing in the journal for an international readership. The third webinar will take place at this time between 1 and 2 o'clock UK time on August the 30th, and it will be on peer reviewing Global South papers. You will see a link to that in the chat. You will also, if you go onto the Sociological Foundation website and just take a look at the events page, there'll be a link for you to register from that. So again, I would encourage people to do, if you're thinking about as a prospective author, it is actually very, very helpful to consider the reviewer's perspective, which is what we'll be looking at in the 30th of August webinar. It helps to think about your paper holistically, not just in terms of your aspirations of it, but how it will be assessed and how it will be reviewed. Now, we don't have any messages in the chats, we don't have any questions, so it just remains for me to thank you all for coming. A very special thanks to Siyang Cao. Thank you very, very much for coming and talking about your important research. It's really, really fascinating in terms of the core questions that I think we as writers should be thinking about, the cultural assumptions and terms inbuilt within our research, and how we translate that for wider audiences. So thank you very much. I hope it was a good conversation. I really enjoyed speaking to you.
Yeah, thank you as well, Daryl. Yeah, and thank you. Thank you all for coming, I think.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We've had some comments that actually we answered a lot of questions just through our discussion. Thank you all very much.